Alex is someone I get along very well with on and off the court. Again, another physical battle, but obviously against an opponent that was, playing on a high level. So I'm glad to overcome it. I was really blown away by how inspired she was. I mean, I was blown away by watching great athletes.
There is a moment in professional tennis, rare and unmistakable, when an absolute legend of the game stops mid-sentence in a crowded press conference to talk not about his own historic match, not about his own impossible records, or even his own legendary legacy, but about someone else entirely, someone younger, someone who is still fiercely climbing the ranks. And that is exactly the shocking scene that unfolded when Novak Djokovic, the 24-time Grand Slam champion, the 10-time Australian Open winner, and a man who has witnessed every single kind of crowd in every distant corner of the tennis universe, sat down after his second-round victory at the 2026 Australian Open. Without being pushed by reporters, and completely unprompted, he chose to openly talk about Alex Eala, the young Filipina prodigy who had just walked off court 6 after a heartbreaking first-round exit. Yet, somehow, she left behind a much bigger footprint at Melbourne Park than most players leave after winning an entire title. That massive contradiction, a first-round loss creating a far bigger global story than most quarterfinal victories, is exactly the kind of phenomenon that makes this story worth telling slowly. Worth unpacking piece by piece? Because on the surface it looks like a simple, generous quote from an aging champion being nice to a rising star. But underneath it lies a much more explosive story about what modern tennis is truly becoming. About who gets to be a superstar in this sport. About how a country with virtually zero tennis history can suddenly produce a name that completely overflows a stadium. And about why Djokovic, a man who built his entire career on cold, relentless precision, looked at Alex Eala and saw something he respected enough to praise publicly in front of the world's media. This deep respect is the real headline here, far more than any single viral quote, because respect from Novak Djokovic is never handed out casually. It is earned through blood, sweat, and absolute grit. And Alex Eala earned it that day not by winning her match, because she actually lost it, but by doing something that matters infinitely more in the grand scheme of sports. She moved an entire room. She moved thousands of passionate people who had perhaps never watched a single professional tennis match in their entire lives before that moment. She single-handedly moved a massive global diaspora that had been waiting patiently for decades for a name to attach their national pride to, and she did it on the biggest stage in Australian sport during the very first week of the year when every single eye in the tennis world is pointed directly at Melbourne Park. To truly understand why Djokovic said what he said, we have to peel back the layers and understand who Alex Eala actually is behind the scenes. Not the flashy headline version, not the sensationalized clickbait version, but the real human being who was built over years of quiet, exhausting, grinding work far away from any media cameras. Alexandra Eala did not just miraculously appear out of nowhere, nor was she discovered in some lucky viral video online. She was built deliberately and patiently, the exact way real, enduring champions are crafted. Sent as a young, homesick teenager all the way from the Philippines to Rafael Nadal's famous academy in Mallorca, Spain, she entered a world specifically designed to strip away comfort and replace it with rigid structure, hardcore discipline, and endless repetition. We are talking about thousands of grueling hours of repetitive drills, exhausting footwork patterns, and heavy mental conditioning, the completely unglamorous side of professional tennis that absolutely nobody posts on social media. It was there, far away from her family in the tropical heat of Manila, that Eala built the powerful baseline game that would eventually announce itself loudly to the world. It started quietly in 2021 when she became the first Filipina to ever win a match on the WTA Tour. A milestone that in most Western countries would be a mere footnote, but in the Philippines, a nation of more than 110 million people with almost no modern tennis infrastructure, this was seismic. It was the kind of historic moment that gets replayed on national television on loop. The kind of moment parents point to when telling their children that absolutely anything is possible. Even if your country has never produced a major name in this sport before, Then, in 2022, she added a massive layer to that foundation by capturing the Junior Grand Slam title at the US Open, proving to the critics that her promise was not a fluke, and proving that the grueling years away from home and the sacrifice of a normal childhood were finally paying off in a way that could be documented and celebrated globally. By early 2026, the story had accelerated so fast that she was standing proudly in the main draw of the Australian Open for the very first time in her career, no longer just a promising junior or a name hidden away in qualifying draws, but a genuine main draw competitor at one of the 4 tournaments that define the entire sport. And this is the precise moment where her story beautifully intersects with Novak Djokovic, because what happened next on Court 6 was not really about traditional tennis at all. It was about raw crowds, electric attention, and the beautiful, strange chaos that happens when a nation that has never had a tennis hero suddenly gets one. The sheer numbers tell a massive part of the story on their own, as the 2026 Australian Open recorded an unbelievable all-time record of more than 101,000 spectators through its gates. While there were many logical reasons for that incredible growth, like expanded grounds and ticketing changes, there is simply no serious way to tell the story of that historic attendance surge without mentioning the absolute madness of Alex Eala's first-round match. On paper, her match against the powerful Alicia Parks looks like a standard. Disappointing early exit, a straight sets loss with a tough scoreline that suggests a completely one-sided contest. And yet, that exact match became the most talked about viral moment of the entire first week of the tournament. Not because of what happened structurally on the court, but because of the incredible human energy that exploded around it. Endless lines started forming outside Court 6 long before the players even stepped out to warm up. It was a smaller show court venue, never designed to handle the massive ocean of fans that showed up that day. Giant Filipino flags were unfurled, passionate chants echoed across the grounds, and the cheering was so extraordinarily loud and constant that tournament officials and match umpires had to repeatedly address the noise levels over the microphones. In a sport that is built entirely on hushed, sacred silence during rallies and polite, gentle applause after points, this was a complete culture shock. This was a crowd that behaved much more like a chaotic football stadium or an intense boxing match. They cheered on double faults, they roared on unforced errors from Eala's opponent, and they cheered with a kind of raw, uncomplicated, pure joy that traditional tennis purists are simply not used to seeing. It would have been incredibly easy, and almost expected for a veteran champion like Djokovic to roll his eyes at that chaos, to complain about the disruptive noise the way some other players quietly did behind closed doors, or to treat it as an annoying inconvenience distracting from the serious business of championship tennis. But instead, Djokovic did something that revealed a lot about his inner character and how he views the sport at this ultimate stage of his legendary career. He defended it completely. He explained it to the Western media. He contextualized it beautifully, and in doing so, he gave Alex Eala something that money can never buy, and rankings can never accurately measure: pure, unadulterated validation from the very top of the tennis mountain. When Djokovic sat down in front of the press after his own exhausting second-round match, a hard-fought win over Italy's Francesco Maestrelli, he wasn't asked about Eala in a scripted or planned way. The topic came up completely naturally during a broader media conversation about the tournament's massive crowd sizes and broken attendance records. Rather than deflecting the question or giving a generic, boring response about how nice it is to see full stadiums, Djokovic actively leaned into the specifics. He openly acknowledged that he had been watching what was happening with Alex Eala. He described the roaring crowd as entirely understandable and beautiful, noting that it made perfect sense given where she comes from, a massive, significant country that had never before produced a player of her caliber on the global tour. He correctly identified the Philippines as a nation hungry for a sporting hero in a discipline it had never claimed before. He framed the entire situation, including the ticketing issues, the overflow crowds, and the noise complaints, not as a negative problem, but as what he brilliantly called a good problem. That simple phrase carries immense weight when you consider the source. Djokovic has spent more than 2 decades inside the most hostile, intense arenas in the world. He has played in front of massive crowds who desperately wanted him to lose, supportive crowds who worshipped him, and indifferent crowds who barely knew who he was early in his career. After experiencing every single kind of atmosphere tennis can humanly produce, he looked at the chaos surrounding a first-round loser and told the world, "This is good. This is exactly what the sport needs to grow." That powerful framing completely shifted the narrative for how the rest of the tennis world talked about the Eala phenomenon in the weeks that followed.